Welcome to another episode of Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. And on this episode, I'm thrilled to have Arif Hasan on the show. He is the owner of the Wide Left Substack. Arif, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting newsletter. Looking for some action on any given weekend? This is the free service for you, as 5 Nugget Saturday is my curated list of tips and analytics. To sign up for free, go to thepowerrank.com. Arif, I've been really interested in this composite big board that you have been doing. It was a very interesting tool heading into the draft, and I think it's actually even more interesting of a tool as we head into the 2024 NFL season, and we're trying to evaluate all these rookies. Tell us about how you started doing this composite big board, why yours is different, and then what we can get out of it.
Yeah, way back in 2013, I following the Vikings, and I'm trying to figure out, like, hey, the Vikings have, these 2 first-round picks, turned into 3 eventually during the draft, but like these 2 first-round picks. And because they were relatively late in the draft, the possibilities were endless, right? What they could do, and I didn't really have a good sense of, what players were intriguing or worth keeping track of, or whatever. And so, I'm trying to figure out, like, who should I pay attention to? And I think everybody has this kind of desire, and so I went around and I looked at, I think it was like CBS Sports Big Board, which at the time I think was run by Dan Brugler. And I looked at that and I was like, oh, this is really great. And I was like, well, that's just like one person's opinion. And I go around and I look at all these other boards, just, around the internet. And, I realize, like, all of these boards have like something different to say about these players or value these players in different ways. And so I kind of, brought everything together, engineered a way to basically average out the ranks a little bit, which is not something I like doing anymore. We could talk a little bit more about the process in specifics in a bit, but I averaged out the ranks a little bit, constructed a board, and I was like, well, the Vikings don't need this guy and they don't need this guy, and I could just throw out these players or move these players around. And so I constructed my own board based off of like those intuitions and move some players around. And at the end of the 2013 draft, I was like, oh my God, this was like an incredible tool to have available to me. I kind of wish that I had like published it, or I'd kind of wish that I had done more with it. So for the 2014 draft, I did that and I played around with it a lot to see kind of what the best ways to bring all this data together was. And I didn't end up publishing that because I wasn't really happy with the results. But by the time we got around to the 2015 draft, I was like, okay, I can do this in a systematic way. I gathered, I think at the time, around 40 different analyst boards. And I realized, like, the ways that we want to average these, player valuations, the ways that we want to treat outliers and data, the ways that we want to treat different types of analysts. These are all really interesting and important questions that I think, need to be asked and answered for anybody who wants to construct something like this. And, if I'm doing that, I also am a writer. So I can also write about that process. And so that's when I really started doing it and coming up with different types of big boards, coming up with, ways to take a look at player valuation, realizing that, hey, if an analyst says this is the best player in the draft, that is a much more emphatic statement about that player than if an analyst says this is like the 140th best player in the draft. And I should respect that. And so finding ways to bring all of that together, I published, my first consensus big board in 2015. And I was really happy with the result. I got a ton of great response from people from that, and so I decided to continue it. So I've got a database essentially going back to 2014, but publicly 2015, of these consensus big boards. And every year I add more and more boards to the data, which creates some problems going back and doing some comparisons in history, but for that year makes the data set a little bit more robust. So I'm always happy to do it, and it's become part of like my brand, I guess, to put it, in Draft Twitter, where I take all of these rankings and I bring them together. And one of the things that's really cool is that people will now, instead of me looking for it, people will actively they'll send me their big boards, and then I can return with insights. Nice. Like, hey, yeah, it's awesome. And they're really happy to see, like, who are you highest on? Who are you lowest on? Hey, did you misspell any player names? I'm not going to publish it. I'm just going to tell you, that kind of thing. It's really fun. And, if they miss a player, they're always kind of happy to be like, oh, I'm glad you caught that. So it's a really fun way to connect with a lot of people in the industry, a great way to understand people's thinking in the industry, and a great way to get a temperature of the draft.
You mentioned that you don't just average the ranks. Does every big board give you some kind of number behind every player so you can average that instead?
So some big boards include player grades, and I could, in theory do that. But because most just give you the rank, what I instead do is I convert the rank into a player value based off of a combination of the NFL's historical valuation of a draft pick. So the first overall pick is worth like 3,000 points, according to, the Rich Hill chart, right? The trade chart.
Got it.
And also, which is, I think, a really phenomenal tool, and props to Rich Hill over at Pat's Pulpit for putting it together. And then also I combine it with the Chase Stewart approximate value chart to get a good understanding of player value from there. And then I kind of mapped those out, and then I essentially created a logarithmic regression in Excel, very simple. And I assigned that value to that number. So, you're the number one player. So this guy gave you 3,000 points. You're the number two player. This guy gave you 2,600 points. You're the number three player. This guy gave you 2,300 points, something like that. Right. And I average those out, but then I throw out the outliers and only take the middle. I think it's called the interquartile mean. So I get rid of the top 25% and the bottom 25% of the values, and I average that out. And that produces a really consistent. I've checked this against averaging the ranks, against not throwing out outliers, against just using medians. And the interquartile mean seems to be the most successful at predicting player outcomes and also predicting draft outcomes. And so I'm really confident in that approach. And I think I'm the only one that does that. I think a lot of people just average the ranks, and which is a super intuitive way to do it. I don't really have, and I think that produces different interesting insights, but I really like, the results of this process. I think it's really valuable.
For sure. How do you quantify the accuracy of your composite big board?
Yeah, so I used to do it by a combination of like snap count and approximate value over at Pro Football Reference. That was okay. It's an okay tool. And for when it was produced, it was an astounding leap forward in the way that we understood player value, but we've got a lot more sophisticated tools now. So this year I ran it against a combination of snap count and Pro Football Focus's wins above replacement statistic, which people really dislike, but which is fine. I think it's any tool is subject to criticism, but like if you can't give me a ranking of every player from the last 10 drafts, I'm not interested in that much of your critique, as it were. And so doing that and then adjusting that because, obviously quarterbacks are going to rank really high in the wins above replacement statistic. Adjusting that for the historical value of each position that the NFL assigned in the draft a little bit gives me essentially the player ranking from that draft class of that player. And so then I take the value of that player ranking. So if you're the top player with 3,000, if you're the second player, 2,600, that thing. So I take the value of that player ranking and subtract it from the value of the consensus board rank or the individual board rank or whoever I'm comparing the accuracy of, and also the value of the NFL draft pick. Because the NFL essentially produced a big board during the draft, right? And I subtract it and I square it to create a variance, and then I average that player variance or average whatever variances need to be averaged for whatever I'm doing, trying to figure out if a player was correctly valued or if the ranks were close to accurate or something like that. And so that's what I did is I did that to see, hey, if you ranked the 30th best player 28th, you did a pretty good job. If you ranked the best player second, you probably did a pretty good job. And so minimizing variance was the way that I determined, who had the most accurate player outcome board. And then you could just do that for predicting the draft too. I think that if you pick I think that if you just apply the same process, but instead of ranking players by how they performed, where they were picked in the draft, you can judge individual big boards or the consensus big board against the draft to see how accurate they are. I think that, getting the first 10 picks is more important than getting the next 20 or something. So I think that reflects that too.
Interesting, right? So you talked about this method of quantifying these errors, and it gives you a method for knowing just how good your composite big board is and how good 101 different big boards are. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then I would presume the composite big board is more accurate than all the 101
with a majority of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, in every individual year, some people are just going to even if you were to, blind dart board, right? Someone's going to do better, right? That's just the nature of statistics. But also, these people are very good at their jobs. And so they're even better than a blind, monkey throwing at a dartboard. And so the consensus board places in the top 10 out of, if I've got like 70 boards, it places in the top 10. If I've got 100 boards, it tends to place in the top 10. Every year, I think it's placed top 10 or better, and most years it places top 5. And some people have consistently outperformed the consensus board. Unfortunately, one of them, Gil Brandt, has passed away. And another one has stopped doing it, Mike Mayock. These people are insanely good at their jobs. But for the most part, the consensus board is the best year-to-year evaluation, and I think it's just because if you get a lot of people that have a pretty decent understanding, and these people have more than a decent understanding, but at least a decent understanding of what they're looking at, and ask them to perform a rank ordering task. If you combine them, historically, I mean, studies have demonstrated that the wisdom of the crowds on rank ordering tasks is extremely accurate, which, I mean, you're in the betting space, that's kind of how betting markets tend to work too. Yeah. And the consensus board performs really well. I published a piece about who did the best between 2016 and 2021 among the individual big boards. And the piece itself doesn't spend very much time talking about the consensus board. I wanted to talk about the analysts. But when you throw the consensus board back in as if it were one of the analysts, I believe in ranking the top 100 players, it was third over that 6-year time span. And in the total draft, it was like ninth out of all of the boards. So I think it does a really, and that includes against the NFL, if the NFL's draft itself was treated as a board. So I think it's a really phenomenal tool.
That is really awesome. I think Mike Mayock, I have kind of a negative interpretation of him after his time in Las Vegas, but I will revise that now if he's actually beating the wisdom of crowds. I always want to change my opinion on things.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised by that too, but I've also always been under the impression that Mike Mayock's tenure was interfered with a little bit by John Gruden. So I didn't want to judge him too harshly there.
For sure, but I also, if I remember right, I never dug into a season while Mayock was the GM and been like, oh man, yeah, that's I love what he's doing with this team, right? I mean, wasn't their defense like awful every single season that he was there?
It was. If you take a look at the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round picks, he actually did a really excellent job with those drafts on identifying those players. But perhaps, I mean, a general manager does much more than ranking players on a draft big board. There's so much involved from like player contracts, negotiations, and free agency.
Yes.
And I don't know that he was necessarily prepared for that part of the role either. So,
but he's a wizard at evaluating players. I mean, that's the only way to beat a wisdom of crowds tool like what you have, right? I mean,
consistently, yes. Yeah.
Consistently. Exactly. Yes. So I've done a lot of work on wisdom of crowds. It is actually my primary tool for NFL preseason rankings. And so one of the things I do is I just take subjective power rankings basically the week before the season comes out. And I actually have to do something similar because, these subjective power rankings don't come with a rating, right? You just get a number. And so I take essentially the last 10 years of my power rankings. Actually, not even my power rankings, just like my simple team rankings. And I guesstimate what a rating should be because of that.
Right.
So it's a tool that I've been doing for a long time. And I haven't run it I haven't added in data from the 24 season, but I was actually shocked last year to see that like the preseason rankings were about 55% against the spread for the first 5 weeks of the season.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's mind blowing. I it's actually better than some other like market based stuff that I do in the preseason that you would expect to be better. Like when you, the other tool is like you take win totals and you try to back out well, you don't try, you actually back out a rating for how that team should do based on those market win totals. ATS is significantly better than that. And
That's remarkable.
yeah, and you know, it's a big reason why my numbers have done so well. Like I do keep that preseason prior there for most of the season, and yeah, so I'm always a fan of wisdom of a crowd approaches. Really like what you're doing. I'm actually kind of surprised that some individuals can beat your consensus. I find that interesting as well. Let's go back to your 2024 board real quick. Maybe just give us a player or two that you are interested in following because of your big board.
Typically the quarterbacks are always, and not just because we love to follow quarterbacks, but also because they tend to produce the highest variance, and also teams tend to quote unquote overdraft them versus the consensus board. Jaden Daniels and JJ McCarthy were two of the most polarizing players in this draft. Like one of the analyses I run is to see, which players people disagree on the most relative to their ranking. Obviously, you're going to get a lot more disagreement on who the 100th ranked player is, just because there's a smaller bandwidth of talent to evaluate. So small differences produce large differences in rank at the 100s versus at the one. So once you adjust for that, Jaden Daniels and JJ McCarthy were the two most polarizing players at the quarterback position, followed by Drake May. And so I thought that was like pretty interesting. So of course I want to follow them, and it's easy to follow quarterbacks because we can't stop talking about them. So, very, very fun kind of avenue of discussion. But beyond that, I think, players like Mike Sanderstill, a nickelback from Michigan, drew a fair amount of disagreement. Yeah. And everyone loves him. What's interesting is that, his variance is really high, but if you dig into like the scouting reports of some of the people that ranked him low, what they're saying, it's not that they don't like the guy, it's that they just don't see what his NFL position might be, or if a team is going to use him correctly. But they think that if he lands in the right spot, he's going to be really great. And it's like one of the few times where I've seen a high variance player, not receive that many negatives on a scouting report from the people who rank him the lowest. I think the only other time I can remember this happening was like Hunter Renfrow, and he was picked in the 5th round, and he massively outperformed what a 5th round pick should do. And hey, he's still available. I think a team should probably, pick him up. I don't know that, the Raiders, when they switched to McDaniels, used him correctly. So, but I think that kind of stuff is interesting. People like Patrick Paul is a high variance offensive tackle. I think he got drafted relatively high versus consensus, if I remember correctly. And when you've got a high variance player who is drafted above their consensus ranking, my data suggests that player is much more likely to hit their NFL draft valuation than their consensus ranking, because whatever team, did reach for him, they're following kind of the high variance end of that crowd ranking, and they tend to be a little bit more correct than if you reach for a player that everyone agrees should be ranked, several ranks below, right? So there's a lot, which I think that's really cool, is that even the variance in the rankings produce outcomes that you would expect to see once you test them. And some of these players, I'm really curious about, how that's going to turn out based off of that. So, players like Mike Sanderstill, Patrick Paul, Troy Franklin, who fell really dramatically in this draft, was a really high variance player too. And so, he was ranked 39th, but there were a lot of people that just didn't see it with him. So we'll see if, maybe they were correct. I don't know, like all of this stuff is like always kind of interesting to me. Like if like a fifth or sixth round pick, kind of blows up like Puka Nacua did last year, sometimes I'll go back to the consensus boards like, hey, what did people think of him? And he was kind of like a Sanderstill kind of guy, where the people that ranked him low didn't actually dislike him all that much. But the people that liked him a lot. He was a fairly high variance player, and it's where when players who demonstrate technical capability and have on-field production but have poor testing, that tends to produce a high variance ranking because it puts people's values into sharp focus. But yeah, that kind of stuff is always fascinating to me. I could talk about this forever.
That is fascinating. I think with Puka Nacua, there were injury issues, if I'm not mistaken, right? Towards the tail end of his college career. And
he had injury issues. And I think if you'll find a lot of the people that test poorly but produce well in the NFL, people like Anquan Boldin or Jarvis Landry, you'll find very often, I think Landry might be the exception, but you'll find very often that the people who tested poorly and do well in the NFL were either had injury issues near the end of their college career or were notably injured when they ran their drills, which to me validates the testing even more. People will point to these outliers without realizing that the context behind these outliers actually makes a pretty good argument for the testing itself more than anything else. So I find that the only really true outlier of a receiver running slower than 4.7 and succeeding, I think, is Jarvis Landry, because Bolden was injured. Jerry Rice actually ran a 4.49 when he tested, and the story about him running a 4.71 is apocryphal. Larry Fitzgerald ran a 4.49, but people thought he ran a 4.7 because of a database error on a website. Stuff like that. Yeah.
So in what sense do you mean that the testing is validated when with these players?
So it would, because when people are looking for reasons to discount combine testing, and there's a billion reasons that I think are legitimate, they will often point to players that ran slow in the 40 that tend to play wide receiver. That's like the thing that they look at. And there's a very small list of names that they'll go to because there's very few receivers that have run slower than a 4.7 that have succeeded in the NFL. And of course, some of them are very appealing. People like, Anquan Boldin, who had just an insanely good start to his career, or people like Jerry Rice, who's the best wide receiver of all time if you're not a Vikings fan. Or Larry Fitzgerald for a while, right? And you go in and you take a look at kind of what this is telling you, and really what this is suggesting is that players who test poorly must have a reason for testing poorly. And in most of these cases, the reason is they're injured. In some of these cases, it's because they're not very athletic. And in the cases where they're not athletic, they don't tend to succeed. And so that's what I mean by it validates testing. It gives us, like, we need to find out what the reason is, and then what does that reason tell us, right? But yeah, other than that, like, I do think that we tend to focus on the wrong numbers in combine testing and stuff like that. But I think that
absolutely,
in doing so, a lot of people dismiss athletic testing entirely, which I think is a mistake.
Yeah, I think it's a mistake to dismiss it entirely. The NFL goes the other way and drafts anyone that can run a 4.3, right? And there's a complete morgue of NFL wide receivers that have shattered, have just run explosive 40 times at the combine, right? From John Ross to Henry Ruggs to, I'm sure I'm missing some people, but
yeah. I mean, Corey Coleman. I think the most recent example of a pure speedster that sort of succeeded is like Will Fuller, and I just feel like if that's your example, that you're grasping at straws, that's tough. Because he had some nice half seasons, but he got injured and he couldn't sustain it, and that's But yeah, no, if you're focusing on a guy that's a pure speedster as opposed to a guy that is renowned for his technical prowess and on-field production that happens to run fast, like in Amari Cooper, I think is a really great example of that. It's worrisome. And what's interesting about this year's example, Xavier Worthy, is that he is kind of in this gray zone of people have perceived him as a pure speedster, but the way the scouting reports have talked about him, talk about him as a guy who has the ability to threaten at all three levels. People are talking about actually there's quarterback issues at Texas, which of course, given like the 15 stars they have on that depth chart is kind of funny.
Right, exactly.
but um, but but yeah, I mean, people will put together these cut ups of like, these poor throws from Queen Ewers or whatever to Xavier Worthy, and it's like, well, okay, sure. But they have like Xavier Worthy running intermediate routes, which is always your concern with some of these speedsters. And I've fallen in love with speedsters too, like Devin Smith from Ohio State before those Ohio State wide receivers were virtual locks. Isn't a good example of a person that I was like, there's no way this guy could fail, and of course he did. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a demonstrable. I think people have looked into this, but there's a demonstrable overdrafting effect on 40 times.
Oh yeah,
But
yeah.
if you split it out by like, I think it's either flying 20 or 20 yard split, the effect in one direction kind of disappears. And so they really are just looking at a 40 time and not looking at acceleration or pure speed. It's very funny.
Right. I think Sumer and Tej Seth did do some stuff looking. I mean, clearly the 40 time correlates with draft position for wide receivers. I think he showed that pure 40 time wasn't a very good predictor of wide receiver success in the NFL. I don't think that was broken up into, final 20 yards or other things that are, more important, right? Or potentially more important.
Right. There's a lot, and I actually did write a piece over at my Substack, which I haven't plugged yet. Wide-left.football.
We'll get there. We're getting there.
Yeah, but I mentioned that I don't like using relative athletic score when I evaluate the athleticism of players, and it's not any shade to Kentley Platt, who does over at MathBomb, who does the relative athletic score, but that's simply not how players play, right? Some athletic elements are going to be different based off of your position. But one thing that I've found when I've experimented with athletic data is even if you split it up by position, there are ways to split it up even more. When I split up defensive tackles by essentially big and small, which are proxies for nose tackle and three technique, I found that different athletic measurements mattered more for nose tackles than for three techniques. And then when I split up receivers into three size buckets based off of their height, very short, very tall, and the majority of them the middle, I found three different athletic models correlated best with their eventual NFL performance. And I feel like that's very intuitive, and I don't know why most of the people working with athletic data have not tried doing that. I don't know. It seems like something that you could do and make some pretty significant advancements towards.
Absolutely. Maybe definitely work for the future. You mentioned these high variance players in your big boards, right? Like the players that some people think are great and some people think are bad. This Patrick Paul from Houston, this offensive tackle. I almost think about it as like a wisdom of a sub crowd, right? Like you should reach for a player that, maybe 30 people really have ranked pretty high, right? Is that kind of the idea there? I mean, I love the nuance that you put around some of these players, but maybe there is some general principles there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think so. So I've done some analysis on what happens when teams steal a player, what happens when they reach for a player, what happens when they get even value for a player, and what the variances were in those situations. And I found that when the NFL, when a team steals a player, right, something must happen for that to occur, which is that 30 odd teams must agree that that team is not as good as the consensus board believes that that player is, right? And that is a really powerful signal, but it's not a total signal. And what I found is that the NFL is closer to correct on what that player's eventual rank order in his draft class is going to be, but that player still generally outperforms the average pick at that position. And so using that rank order as a hit rate, which is a very actually harsh definition of a hit, I think about 40% of players hit using that definition. And I think it's probably not fair, but using that as a baseline, 44% of steals hit, about 38% of even picks hit, and about 27% of reaches hit, which is super significant to me. And I was like, well, what happens when a steal is universally liked versus high variance? That doesn't change the data that much. What happens when a reach is super high variance versus super low variance? Well, that does change the data somewhat significantly. And it turns out that not only do the reaches that are high variance have a higher hit rate, and I wish I had that number off the top of my head, but they're also more likely to hit like big. They're more likely to have a significantly better career than their pick slot or their consensus board rank. And that's true when I include quarterbacks and when I exclude quarterbacks, because I was worried that Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen were screwing up the data because they were both reaches that were really high variance and they both hit tremendously, right? It's like, okay, well, what happens if I just get rid of it? And it turns out that's still the case. That a high variance reach is if you're committed to a reach and you want to use the consensus board to check yourself as a team, which I know teams don't do, but let's imagine that they wanted to do that. The way that if I were a team trying to determine whether or not I wanted to trade down and see if I can grab that player at a later pick slot, or if I absolutely needed to have that player, is see if, like you said, well, if at least 30 of these 100 people think that this player is actually worth it, and I am this committed to my process that I think this player is worth it, and my coach has like a very clear plan for how to use this player, then yeah, I'm comfortable making this reach here, which is like one reason why I liked with the Eagles selecting Jalix Hunt. I mean, the Eagles got steal after steal after steal, and they had 2 reaches in the draft, and one of them was Jalix Hunt. And I love the Jalix Hunt reach because he has every characteristic profile of a player that could outperform his pick status. And some of the players that they've selected in similar circumstances have not hit. Like Milton Williams is an okay player. He's not like a really high level player, but similar profile, super athletic in the ways that have historically tracked with that position success, really productive at the level of play that they were playing at. High variance for 2 reasons. One reason is because some people really liked him and some people didn't. But another reason is because not a ton of people watched him. And if you're not on a lot of consensus boards, that would suggest to me that either there was some reason that people weren't able to watch you. Maybe you were an international player, maybe like Jalix Hunt, you were playing at the FCS level, whatever, or that people didn't consider you good enough to rank, right? Which is the primary reason most people don't end up on someone's top 100 is because they weren't good enough to be in the top 100. But as someone like Jalix Hunt, who's at a small school, who arrived essentially late in the draft process for people to see his buzz, who's very productive, extremely athletic, he wasn't on a lot of boards. And I don't know why he wasn't on a lot of boards, but I can surmise that one reason could be that people didn't watch him. And so that was a high variance player because it very much seems like the people who watched him ranked him fairly high, relatively speaking. And so that's an example of a reach that I would, as an organization, be comfortable making were I to use the consensus board as like a rough guide for what I wanted to do in the draft.
Excellent. Yeah, I really love the idea of like looking at not just a player's rank, but the variance to get insight. Arif, I would love to know more about your story. How did you get into writing with an analytics bent, and then why left your current? I guess we have to call it Substack. A Substack.
Yeah. So I started out. I actually was not super into football. I was a nerd in high school. My best friend played center for our varsity team, but we would just make fun of each other all the time. I was the captain of the debate team, right? And I dislike sports, and it's like kind of, when you're like in the 2000s and you're a nerd, like the whole deal is that you dislike sports, and I'm glad we're basically over that. But that was my deal. And in college, I joined the college debate team, and the requirement was that you join their fantasy football league, which I thought was stupid, but I was like, I really want to debate, right? And so I got an email saying that they had signed me up for the league, and I'm extremely competitive. I despise losing. And I was like, well, if my name is attached to this, I'm going to get as good at this as possible.
There
so
you
I tried to learn yeah, exactly, right? I think a lot of us enter a lot of our ventures that way, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, how do I figure out how to draft, the best fantasy team? So I dig into it, and I'm reading a bunch of, this is like, I think back in like 2009. So it's like, and as as a person living in Minnesota and becoming a Vikings fan, of course, 2009 was like a very important year for getting you attached to football, given what Brett Favre was able to do. But I learned as much as I could about football, and the more I got into it, the more I was like, I don't think this makes sense. Like, I'm like reading this article about this player, and they just say stuff, and I'm like, are you sure? Can you prove that? And as a debater, I'm very attached to the idea of having evidence and demonstrating to me what your thought process is and proving your bona fides and showing me the goods. A lot of people weren't showing me the goods. So I sought out, all of these places that would give me more definitive answers, or at least provide something compelling as opposed to a truism. What does it mean that a guy has it? I don't know. But what does it mean when a guy has really high win probability added? I've got a good idea of what that means. So, okay, I'll take a look at that. And it turns out that when you're essentially the underdog in terms of analysis, like analytics was and still kind of is, but significantly more back then, you do a lot more work to prove that you're right. And they were showing their work, and that was really appealing to me. So that's kind of what I fell into, and I realized that a lot of areas could really use back testing. So during the draft, the 2011 draft, the Vikings were considering a quarterback. And I knew that the Vikings weren't going to get Cam Newton or anything like that, but he was the quarterback everyone was talking about. And one thing that they talked about was that he was a winner. And I was like, I have no idea if Cam Newton's going to be good or bad, but that sounds like BS to me. That sounds dumb. And so the very first thing I ever wrote was this rant about how we probably shouldn't talk about winners. And I went back to all of the national championship quarterbacks over the previous 20 years, and I looked at their NFL success. And at the time, I think only one had won a playoff game. Yeah, like a couple of them weren't even drafted, right? And I was like, oh, this is a bogus indicator. This means nothing. And so I wrote that, and I published it over at the Daily Norseman, the SB Nation site for the Vikings. And they encouraged me to continue publishing, and they were wonderful. And they were like, hey, your stuff is really good. We'll put you at the front page. We'll actually, because they've got a fan post section, and then they've got like your front page, your masthead, your primary guys. And they were like, we'll put you on the masthead. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. So I did that, and I focused on like the stuff that you can prove and demonstrate. And, I'm learning alongside the readers about, these elements of football, and analytics was just really geared towards that. Plus I think the way that I think tends to, I like thinking in probabilistic terms. I like thinking, very carefully and using words like the data suggests, right, as opposed to we know, right. I took AP stats, so it's not like I'm completely a novice to statistics, but I didn't really take statistics in college. And so I had to learn a lot of statistical terms along the way and kind of bootstrap my way into some level of competence there. But I did try to learn a lot about scheme and film study and stuff like that, and that I think has really improved my writing too. But that was the direction I went in, and so I went from being a blogger at the Daily Norseman to writing over a Bleacher Report, and then I was recruited to be part of a startup to do Minnesota-based sports coverage at a website called ZoneCoverage.com. They're still around; they're still kicking. I love them. And then from there, The Athletic liked my work, and they hired me, and I was at The Athletic for a couple of years before I moved to Pro Football Network. And then I wanted to continue writing national stuff, and Pro Football Network is moving into more of doing local coverage again. So I started a Substack, which of course I'm still doing local stuff because the Vikings are the people I'm most familiar with. But if I want to write about a national topic, I do that. And because I have a debate background and I used to work in politics, I also, over at the Wide Left Substack, do have political content there. People can ignore it if they want. That's fine. But, a lot of people have asked me to do that. And so I'm happy to do that. So that's kind of how I got to where I am. People have, luckily have like really enjoyed my work, and I've been blessed to be able to grow my brand at a time where it was a lot easier to do that. Starting out with one of the first Vikings Twitter accounts that regularly posted about the Vikings was great, because I think that's probably pretty hard to make a name for yourself now. But that allowed me to build the audience I needed to be able to feel comfortable launching a Substack. So that's what Wide Left Football is.
Awesome. And I mean, you do most of the writing, but you also hire other people or get other contributors to Wide Left
Yeah.
as well, right?
Yep. So for the first couple of months, it was just me, and I realized like if I want to spend time doing these like deeper, longer form pieces or deeper explorations, I'm not going to provide regular content to people. So I reached out to Luke Braun, who does Locked On Vikings and does some other excellent work. And I was like, hey, the way that you write, the way that you think, and we have a podcast together, so it's obvious we already have chemistry. The way that you write, the way that you think really aligns with, I think, what the audience expects over at Wide Left. So, we negotiated a rate, and he produces when he produces, and I'm happy to pay him whenever that occurs. And so it's produced a more regular site. Recently, Tyler Forness has, left Vikings Wire over at USA Today to do some stuff over at Sporting News, but when you leave one platform for another, there's always a style shift, and so sometimes the stuff that you want to write might not be the greatest fit for the new website that you're at. So I told him, hey, if you find something that you want to write that is a good fit for deeper exploration of the kinds of football discussions that we like to have over a Wide Left, feel free to do that, and I'll pay you to produce content there. So. So far I've got, two people writing content somewhat regularly to help me out for when I'm going to go dark for a couple of weeks and produce like an investigative journalism piece like the one I did over on the Draft Network, or if I'm, crunching data for like the consensus board or something. I've talked to other people that, if they want to contribute and if they've got some good ideas for what that's going to look like, I can talk to them to make sure that, I've got something available, because, when people are paying you for content, it's important that you provide that content. And so I want to make sure that I fulfill that contract with the readers.
So who should subscribe to Wide Left?
I think anybody who wants to learn more about the way that football operates, the way that the NFL operates, and the way the industry operates. There's a lot of stuff I've written over there about sports writing as an industry, and sometimes that's some of my most successful work. It's a lot less about up to the minute news. This is the score of this game, and a lot more of, hey, why do people disagree on Jordan Love? Let's talk about that. Or hey, there's a lot of different theories about how you develop quarterbacks in the NFL. Let's talk about that. So it's a lot more about those kind of deeper explorations. And then, of course, I do touch on culture a little bit. Aaron Rodgers and his conspiracy theory stuff. I've written, a pretty deep piece there. The politics of Super Bowl and Super Bowl advertising. I wrote a piece there. So anything that I think warrants a deeper exploration is something that I think is a really good fit for Wide Left. It's always about, making sure that you can sit down and learn something from, a longer or more in-depth piece that, is meant to be careful and researched than anything else. So that's really the goal of the newsletter. And that's what readers come in to see.
Arif Hasan, thank you so much for your time in breaking down your awesome work on the composite big board. Please let everyone know where they can find your work.
Yeah, so you can find my work over at wideleft.football. You can also find me on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it at Arif Hasan NFL. I technically have accounts at other sites like Threads. I think I'm Arif Hasan. At Blue Sky, I'm Arif. I think it's just arif.bsky.social. But yeah, clearly I don't use them that much. So, you try not to be over enthused about the likelihood of content there. I primarily post on Twitter, so you can find me at Arif Hasan NFL. But otherwise, yeah, all of my stuff that gets published is over at wideleft.football.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. Just a reminder, you can grab my free sports betting email newsletter. Check that out at thepowerrank.com. And I will talk to you again soon.